Hello, everyone. We're so glad that you're here on this beautiful Friday afternoon. My name is Lisa Wymore, and I'm the faculty advisor for Berkeley Arts and Design. Berkeley Arts and Design connects and fortifies creative departments and units throughout the Berkeley campus, and we're funded through philanthropic donations, and we run a various series of talks. This one is through the Humanities 20 class, so welcome Humanities 20 students. And it has approximately 50 students enrolled, and they come to various lectures throughout the semester. We're also in partnership with BAMPFA, and we thank them for sharing the space and for this ongoing collaboration we've had with them for many years. Welcome to this afternoon's talk, Ephemeral Monuments, Place-Based Storytelling Through Installations, Audio, and Augmented Reality. Susan Moffat is a curator, urban planner, and writer who works at the intersection of culture, nature, and place, with a special interest in race, parks, and public space. As a creative director of Future Histories Lab here at Berkeley and executive director of the Global Urban Humanities Initiative, she leads the development of community partnerships, courses, and workshops, and teaches humanities studios. A former journalist, she has a deep belief in the power of stories to make change. She works in affordable housing, environmental advocacy, and shoreline planning. Moffat is the founder and executive director of Albany Bulb, which is near my house, and I love to go there. And thank you for all that incredible work you do there, which is an arts organization dedicated to protecting the creative spirit of the Albany Bulb landfill. She has an AB in history and literature from Harvard University and an MS in journalism from the Columbia University, and a Master of City Planning from UC Berkeley. In spring 2021, students in our undergraduate course, Ghosts and Visions, created a mile-long tour of the history of California's extractive industries as a former dump on San Francisco Bay called Monument to Extraction. By making outdoor sculptures, an audio tour, and augmented reality projects, the students told stories of exploitation of Chinese immigrant labor in the dynamite industry, World War II industrialization, housing segregation, and industrial agriculture. Moffat will speak about the project as one facet of the work of the UC Berkeley Future Histories Lab, which she directs and offers students a chance to research and reveal Bay Area histories in partnership with local communities while earning a certificate in urban humanities. So check that out, students, if you're interested in that wonderful opportunity. Before we begin, I just want to recognize that UC Berkeley is located in the territory of Huichin, the ancestral and unceded lands of Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone peoples, successors of the sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County and the confederated villages of Lashan. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since its institutional founding. The history of prolific artistic and technical development in this region has always depended on this land. Berkeley Arts and Design is committed to supporting the sovereignty and ongoing relationship of this place of Ohlone peoples through building long-term reciprocity and relationship building with tribal leaders and organizations. This event is being recorded and will be available on the A+C YouTube channel in about a week, and we'll be adding captioning to that if you have any friends or anyone who would benefit from that service. We will be doing a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so students in Hum 20, please make sure you have your card and fill that out and make sure your name is on that. We'll be collecting that for a part of your participation in the class. So let's begin.
Hello, everybody, and thank you, Lisa. It's such a pleasure to be here to talk about landscape and memory and the way that landscapes can either erase or highlight histories that we need to understand in order to imagine better futures. I'm especially pleased to be here because this Ghosts and Visions project was supported by an Arts and Design creative discovery grant that made some of our work possible. So thanks for that. So let me tell you a story. When I was a little girl growing up in Los Angeles, my mother used to take me to a place called Terminal Island in the middle of the port of Los Angeles. And if you can imagine the port of Oakland, you probably know the cranes there, the containers, the trucks belching diesel. Well, that's Terminal Island, except it's much bigger than the Port of Oakland. And at the base of these cranes and in the midst of this industrial landscape and the piles of scrap metal and coal, there was a place that my mother loved to go. And why would she bring a little girl to such a gritty, dirty, kind of ugly place? Well, it's because it's where she grew up. When she was in the middle of that rough landscape, she could hear and see the voices of the children she grew up with. There were people who had names. Their moms were coming out of the houses, going shopping for groceries and going to work in the canneries. The men were sitting there fixing their fishing nets. And so this landscape started to come alive to me as well. And when I was in that space, I also had those stories swirling around me, even though the landscape showed nothing about this thriving community that used to be there and that had been wiped out at the beginning of World War II when the US government came and incarcerated the men, women, and children simply for being of Japanese descent and put them into US concentration camps. The village was bulldozed, the houses were knocked down, and after the war, when people came back, there was no village to come back to. And yet, afterwards, people did come back to remember the place and to take pleasure in kind of this strange landscape that was filled with ghosts and visions. And 20 years ago, the descendants of the folks who had lived in this village made a monument, a physical monument, a statue of some fishermen and a Japanese gate to represent the history there. It's right at the entrance to the federal penitentiary. It's still in the middle of nowhere. And it's, it's wonderful. I love that memorial. It's a great place to go to. It's a rare example, I think, of a memorial and a monument that actually was pretty much designed and controlled by the people whose story it tells. But really what's more vivid than any statue or any physical monument is the stories, and the stories that were performed by our parents and grandparents and that we participated in by actively listening to those stories. And so it's made me think a lot about, there's so many places where we need to know the history of what happened so that certain things don't get repeated and so that we can do better in the future. But whether it's West Oakland, if you take BART to San Francisco, you're going to pass by West 7th Street, which used to be a thriving African-American neighborhood, commercial and entertainment district that was wiped out by urban redevelopment and the post office, the large post office facility there. There's so many places that these stories need to be told. And what is the best way to tell those stories? What is the most permanent way, long-lasting, that is not necessarily set in stone, because the stories evolve, they morph, they have layers, right? I mean, let's think about where we're sitting right now, okay? You see Strawberry Creek that winds its way through the campus, and then it hits Oxford Street, and it disappears. Have you ever wondered where it goes? Well, it goes underground until it flows all the way to San Francisco Bay, but it doesn't get to the bay until it flows past. Now it's still underground, the West Berkeley Shell Mound, which is a space sacred to the Ohlone peoples who belong to this land and who are still here and are fighting to have their stories and their relationship to this landscape remembered and acknowledged and to take their rightful place. They're working hard to figure out how to use this space that's now looks just like a parking lot at the Shell Mound. How do we tell those stories? Who owns those stories? Who controls how those stories are told in the landscape and through oral traditions and so many different techniques? So these are some of the things that are on my mind as I present to you the story of how my class in spring 2021 decided to use the old landfill called the Albany Bulb as a place to tell stories. So the Albany Bulb was a construction debris landfill from 1963 to 1983, and you can see that it sticks out about a mile into San Francisco Bay, and it's about 4.5 miles northwest of where we're sitting right now. And the idea of our project was that this entire pile of rubble is a monument to waste. It's a monument by itself. It's a giant kind of sculpture made out of rubble. And unlike a lot of landfills all over San Francisco Bay, because almost any time you're on San Francisco Bay walking along the Bay Trail, you're going to be standing on landfill. Because it was a construction debris landfill, the materials were durable, the concrete and the rebar and the metal, and it was never completely capped. And so for decades, artists have been pulling materials out of the landfill and collecting driftwood and playing with it and making art. And it's now a public park, but it's still not fully developed. So it's still a place where people kind of play freely with what they find in the landscape. It's also known as a place where there was an unhoused community that lived for many years until they were evicted in 2014. And that's another layer, an important part of the story here. And in past classes and in past projects, I've worked with the people who once lived at the Bulb to tell their stories. But that wasn't the particular focus of this project. This project, Monument to Extraction, was inspired by a global project called Extraction Art on the Edge of the Abyss, started by Peter Koch, who's a publisher and letterpress printmaker in Berkeley. And he cares a lot about mining because his hometown is in Montana. And he organized what turned into scores of exhibitions and art projects around the world, looking at mining and other extractive industries. And I thought that the Albany Bulb, because the bulb is made of, the concrete relies on sand mining, which causes a lot of destruction in rivers and other places. Of course, metal has to be mined. All of this is also a kind of extraction. So we thought that it would be a kind of good organizing principle for storytelling at the site. But we didn't want to tell the story just of what the materials at the bulb are. That was our starting point. We wanted to look out from the bulb and consider just where it is. So if you look at this yellow spot on the eastern shore of San Francisco Bay, you can see that it's part of the largest estuary on the West Coast. And estuaries are places where salt water mixes with fresh water, and that makes them incredibly productive. And the connection of San Francisco Bay to the state of California you can see in this map here. So that green swath in the middle of California, the Great Central Valley, all of those rivers from Redding up north to Bakersfield down south, they all drain to the Pacific through San Francisco Bay. So we have an incredibly intimate relationship with the Sierra Nevada, with the mining that happened there in the 19th century and that sent so much sediment from hydraulic mining down the rivers that they ended up coating the bottom of San Francisco Bay. That legacy is still there. Industrial agriculture gets to the world markets through San Francisco Bay. All of these places connect us to the entire state of California. It's also a great place if you stand at the Albany Bulb and look out west through the Golden Gate to think about our connections to global supply chains and manufacturing and the flow of resources from back and forth to China and all over Asia. And it's also a place where if we want to understand why is so much of the marshland around San Francisco Bay filled? How come Richmond is so industrialized and Oakland? A lot of that happened during World War II, which was entangled with our history of military engagement with the Pacific. So if you kind of understand what's going on at this little spot on San Francisco Bay, you can kind of understand the world. That was the concept. That's the geographic context. And the temporal context is we were doing this in spring 2021, starting in January. And of course, it was the middle of the pandemic. It was also the wake of what happened after the murder of George Floyd, when there were uprisings all over the United States to protest centuries of violence and police violence. And monuments were being rethought. They were being literally pulled down. Experiments all over the country were happening to think about, okay, we've pulled down the Confederate monuments in New Orleans. What are we going to put up instead? Do we want to put up another statue of a different person? Or do we want to make some temporary projections? Do we want to have performances? What is the process by which we're going to decide about these monuments? The organization Monument Lab in Philadelphia was chronicling and thinking about and creating projects to help us think about how history is told in public space. So we decided to use this strangely shaped peninsula as an observatory. And you can see, it sticks out about a mile. So the 8 stops that we made, the 8 installations we made along this route are elevated. So this peninsula, it's about 30 feet above sea level. So you'll have wonderful views of the Berkeley Hills, of Richmond, of the Golden Gate, of Angel Island. It's a wonderful place from which to see California and the world. And so the stories that we told at these 8 stations included, and the students chose these stories. We talked about different kinds of stories that could be told based on the materials at the site and what you could see from the site. But what we settled on in the end was telling the story of Chinese labor in California, starting into the 19th century and into more recent years, especially as it related to the dynamite industry. Because there, where the Golden Gate Fields racetrack stands right now, that was a dynamite factory. And San Francisco and the East Bay were pioneers in this high-tech industry of dynamite, which served the mining industries, and that caused a lot of deaths of the workers, of the exploited Chinese labor. That was one of the stories. We also told the story of World War II. And, from the Albany Bulb, you can see the Kaiser shipyards in Richmond and all the wartime industry. But we delved into the social history that was spurred by the migration of people and the creation of housing right there in Albany, among other places, at what's University Village now. Cordonisa's Village was the name of it. And it was segregated housing at first, and then it was integrated. And then after the war, we learned it was resegregated. So that was another story that we were able to tell. We looked out at the highways that you can see and the suburbs climbing up the hills, and we talked about transportation and land use and consumption associated with that. We looked at redlining and the history of racially exclusionary zoning and other policies that shaped the landscapes that we look out at. We talked about food, because when you look out from the Albany Bulb, you can see Emeryville. And you may know Pixar, where movies are made. Well, they used to make canned peaches there. It used to be the Del Monte factory. So we were telling that kind of story as well. And finally, we were looking at the Port of Oakland. You can see the cranes, those giant gantries that bring the goods in and out. You can see that from the Albany Bulb. But we told the story not just of how containerization changed global supply chains, but also how the change in labor, because container shipping takes a lot less labor, how that impacted the culture in the African-American communities of West 7th Street. So these were all stories, many different kinds of stories, different eras, but they all had a connection to this landscape. So how are we going to tell these stories? The purpose of the class was to think about what methods are going to work. Like I said at the beginning, do you tell stories orally? Do you write things down? Do you make a monument? So we started by using an augmented reality application called Artivive. And you can see some visitors here using it to have an image triggered and get some history while they're in the landscape. And the students made many different kinds of sculptures that represented different aspects of the history, but that used materials like the bricks that are lying all over the bulb, used the local materials to express those stories. The real core of the project and of the tour was an audio tour, and you can still download it and take it. You can even listen to it just online as a podcast, and you can see somebody here listening to it on a bench that we made, and as she's listening, her attention is being directed to different parts of the landscape. Although the tour was really created to be in person, we really wanted to connect people physically with the experience of being in this place. We did create a virtual tour. Kimberly Pack, one of our students, created a fantastic virtual tour, 360 degrees that you can take online. And as I mentioned, the podcast is also available online. And we made a website, and the students wrote articles with photos that tell each of the stories. So this is another resource that's associated with it. So what is it like? What is the experience of taking this tour? So you're walking along, you start at the parking lot, you're listening to the tour. It says walk here, walk there. And the sculptures that the students made draw your attention to certain places and certain views. This sculpture made out of fennel sticks is directing your attention to the Richmond shoreline and the Kaiser shipyards. It's also directing your attention at your feet to this piece of rubble that has a new take on the Rosie the Riveter story, saying, look, there was an impact on housing, there was an impact on social relations and segregation. And then you point your camera, you point your phone at this, and then you get a slideshow that tells you a little bit more about that history. So it's kind of like a treasure hunt, because a lot of these, the rubble and the mosaics triggering the augmented reality, they're kind of hidden, so you can see this visitor finding one of the mosaics. And it's a kind of layered experience. This is Carolina, one of our students, pointing out the mosaic about the Chinese laborers that she is installing there. It's on top of a piece of rubble that already has graffiti on it. So we're working with the layers of art and intervention that are always changing at the Albany Bulb. So we're kind of participating in this conversation that is always ongoing in this public space, a conversation among artists and people who have never met each other, but who communicate with each other by altering what's there. The installations that the students made were often interactive. So the students who made this sculpture utilizing the bricks asked the visitors, to put the bricks, you can put them in and out of this structure. And you can think about the bricks that were made not far away in Richmond, but also, and this was a really, I think, important thing that the students, this was their innovation to say, these bricks represent segregation as well. And that the story tells you that these bricks are used in some of the gateways to neighborhoods in Berkeley that pioneered racially exclusionary zoning. Berkeley likes to think of itself as a progressive place, but a lot of the methods of racial segregation in housing were actually invented here. So this installation is asking you to think about a lot of things. We really wanted to connect with people who maybe didn't come to see our exhibition, but were just out walking their dogs or taking a walk. And so they would see this mobile in the tree and say, what's that? And they'd come over, and then they could connect with the mosaic and the story. And we had a QR code for them to have an easy point of entry so they could learn more about the history. I'm going to show this really short 2-minute video. This is without the sound that you would hear, but it just gives you a little bit of a sense of what it feels like to walk through this tour. Okay, so that gives you a sense of what it's like to walk through the tour. And I'm going to share a little bit of the virtual tour. So if you go to our website, you can connect with this tour. And as I play it, you'll see that, you can get 360-degree views of each installation spot. And if you do this yourself, you can manually twirl yourself around. But this will give you a sense of how the voices of our students guide you through the experience. And this is just another short video.
Welcome to the Monument to Extraction tour of the Albany Bulb. I'm Haley, one of the University of California, Berkeley students who made this tour for you. Later, you'll hear my classmates guide you through 8 art installations. Each art installation centers on 2 things: the materials found right here at the bulb, and the materials extracted from far away and transformed by local industries. We think this mile-long landfill is a kind of huge unintentional monument, a monument to waste and environmental destruction. If we look at it carefully, it can help us understand the history not just of the East Bay, but of California as a whole.
Hi, I'm Carolina. Look to your right at the Golden Gate Bridge. Before the bridge was there, immigrants from around the world passed through that narrow opening between the hills by ship. Some of them came from China. Now look to your left, and you'll see the Golden Gate Fields racetrack grandstand on a hill known as Swimming Point. In the late 1800s, this was a dynamite factory owned by the Giant Powder Company. From the 1880s through 1905, explosions at the site killed scores of workers. Most of the casualties were Chinese people. Many newspaper accounts gave the names of the white workers, but listed only the number of Chinese killed. But in one article, we learn about a man named Hong Loi.
And so then Carolina goes on to explain more about this one particular person's story.
Well,
And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about the process, how we went about creating this tour. But before I do that, I'd like to just pause and ask if there are any questions so far.
Otherwise, it won't be up.
So I heard you mention that the focus for this installation was to tell the stories of Chinese immigrants and people of that past. And obviously there are many stories, but kind of seeing the connection to your own background and your own upbringing, was that the main? How strong would you say that connection was in driving that to be the story that you told?
Thanks. Well, you know, at any location, there are so many stories. And it's interesting because I don't feel like it's my story because I'm not Chinese, right? And yet there are aspects of Asian American history that are shared, right, across many groups, and of, you know, immigrant labor that are shared across so many groups in California. What was interesting to me is that students, Carolina really connected with that particular story. That was the story she wanted to tell more than any other. And I think that the reasons that we're drawn to stories often relates to something in our own family history, or something that emotionally we connect to. And I think that's something really good to follow through on. And I think, you know, at each location, there are so many overlapping histories that we have to recognize that every history is provisional. It's just one part of the story. And so we're kind of adding and layering. And as long as we're not claiming that we're telling the whole story or all the stories of the place, then I think it's valuable to keep adding. But it's always useful if other folks come and say, hey, how about this story as well? And we've had some of that. It's really nice that folks who have discovered us online have said, you know, shared more stories that we hope that we can add.
This was the first time I've ever seen the augmented reality, which I found really, really interesting and fascinating. And so my question would just be, like, you talked a lot about what methods to use to tell stories from the past. What inspired you to go for the augmented reality? Was it a mixture of, like, what was going on in the world? Because you also had the virtual tour, which I don't know if that was, like, a part of making it accessible during the pandemic, or how you decided to go about that. But I just found that really interesting and wanted to know more about it.
Yeah. Well, you know, I was originally interested in augmented reality at the Albany Bulb because the sculptures out there are constantly changing, and the paintings are always changing. And I thought it would be interesting, just aside from this project, to be able to go out there with a phone and just see, you know, all the versions of murals or all the versions of a sculpture that had gone before. Because, again, I have that in my memory, but it would be fun to be able to actually see it and to share the previous versions of things. This particular app turned out to be not that good for that purpose. And we wanted to figure out ways to add information, add stories. And it seemed like a good way to add historic images, especially, so that you're looking at a landscape and then you see a picture that's kind of that same spot that is at that same location. Technically, it was difficult because the internet connection was iffy. And when you're out in the sun, there's glare. And also, you know, a fundamental question we were asking is, does this technology make you more present and help you really connect and understand this place? Or does it take you away from it and you're staring at your phone once again? And I think we would say the results are mixed. This particular app was designed for using in a museum in front of a two-dimensional, painting and you could, animate it or make it, provide information or do something with it. So I think it turned out to be not perfectly successful technically, but it really helped us ask questions about what adds and what takes away. And I would like to experiment more with it, but I also feel like there's something really great about an audio tour where you can be totally present with your other senses and just listening versus having to look back and forth at augmented reality. But I think there's a lot of opportunity there still. Okay, well, I'll continue. Oh, okay, yeah. Oh.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Susan. Do you guys have a sense of how many people are engaging with this? Are you tracking the views or something like that? Or also, they're numbered, right? But do you also have a sense of how people are interacting with the order of your telling? Because I've been at the Bulb many times. I walk my dog there all the time, and I'll see one. I'll be like, oh, okay. Maybe I'll look at that, but I don't follow the order or, so how are people engaging with this idea of the story?
Yeah, we don't know how many people, we haven't been tracking that. We do get feedback, so it's been there since April of 2021, and we still get comments on our, on our website, comments page. So we know people are still discovering it. Yeah, and I've gotten emails from people on the East Coast who discover it, and so it's kind of interesting that way. And that's one of the people who said, "Hey, there are more stories. You need to know these stories too." So I think people are still engaging. It's interesting about people dropping in at different points because we got some visitor feedback, and some folks really liked the narrative that walked you through the whole thing, kind of held your hand. It was an experience. And other people were like, I want more freedom. I want to just be able to choose this one or that one. And I felt kind of constrained to have to follow the whole thing. I'm curious, but we don't really have a good way of knowing who is discovering the piece and engaging with it through the QR codes. Because our original intention was that people download the app and download the audio tour in advance and do the whole thing as a story. But some people are accessing parts of it just by using the QR code. I would say in this and past experiments that the idea of just dropping into bits of information, I think is not always as engaging as engaging with a narrative. And that thread, from the feedback we've gotten from visitors, it's the thread and the connectivity among these seemingly disparate stories that people enjoy. Because this is not really about educating people about facts. It's about kind of helping them think about what questions you could ask about any place. So it's a story. It was intended as a story. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about the student process and how we went about this now, and then we can take more questions. So it was cross-listed in art practice and in city planning, and I'm trained as a city planner, so that's my background. And the questions we really wanted to answer were how can we use landscape to reveal instead of erase history? And what media and technologies help or hinder storytelling and understanding? So, we started out on Zoom, and much of the semester was spent on Zoom, which was, a challenging way to work. But later in the semester, we were able to get outside and be socially distanced and wear our masks and spend time exploring the space and creating prototypes and experimenting with making small monuments that, inspired our later installations. And we had Lynn Jones and Lisa Norman, two artists, teach us how to make mosaics. But even before we did all that, we went through a process of really dropping into the space. I really wanted the students to experience the space kind of naively, without any maps, without any information. So the first visit to the site, I didn't provide any information to the students, but we did provide them a series of exercises. And because we had to do this individually because of COVID, and also because it was better to do this kind of thoughtfully and quietly, one by one, we created it as an invitation. And my wonderful graduate student instructor, Melody Chang, created this beautiful little booklet that was kind of a gift, because we wanted to introduce the notion of gifts and hospitality. And within this little booklet were 12 envelopes, and you were supposed to open just one at a time. And each one invited you to do one sensory exercise. It might be sit down, close your eyes, listen to the farthest away sound you can hear, listen to the closest sound you can hear, or touch the materials in front of you in a certain way, or take this piece of string that we included, tie it in a circle, and just look at that, 1 square foot of dirt in front of you, and count all the bugs and the sticks in there, and just really pay attention to where you are. That was the notion of this exercise of asking students to really connect with the place just through their bodies. We asked them to ask 100 questions and write down 100 questions about the space. And it could be anything from like, what kind of bird is that, to, why do I feel uneasy here? Why do I feel peaceful here? And that wonderful exercise I got from Erica Chung Shuk, who's a theater director and wonderful educator. And I taught with her at the Albany Bulb before, and that was one of the exercises we used. We had the students draw maps, and not just realistic maps, but kind of emotional maps, imaginative maps that showed their understanding of the place, and they sketched and took notes. And we also, in thinking about the relationship of our bodies to the space, we were inspired by the work of Lawrence and Anna Halpern. Lawrence, one of the great landscape architects of the 20th century, and his wife Anna, who's one of the most important choreographers. And they worked a lot together to create this thing called RSV cycles, which is a way of thinking about both landscape design and dance as a kind of score or script for moving through space. And so that's kind of what we were creating for visitors, was a score or a script for moving through space. So we did all this sensory work, and then we also delved into the world of facts and archives. And so after their self-guided tour with no map, I gave the students all kinds of environmental impact reports and maps and studies and just, a ton of facts about the history of the place. And then I asked them to do archival research on the history topics that they chose. And again, because, we were limited by the pandemic, they used a lot of really great digital archives and photo archives at the Bancroft and other places. And that's what they used as the basis of writing their articles for the website, and also for writing their audio scripts. We had a lot of really great guest speakers. This is Vince Medina and Luis Trevino, culture bearers of the Ohlone people here in the East Bay. And they came and told their relationship to the land. And even though that wasn't the primary focus of our project, and there are a number of reasons that we decided not to do that, it was really important for the students to hear this story and have this as context for what we were doing. We also had people who were in the business of making memorials and monuments. Cheryl Barton, a landscape architect who worked with Susan Schwarzenberg, an artist, and Donna Graves, who's a historian and urban planner, to create the Rosie the Riveter Memorial. And they also did work on the National Historical Park around World War II history in Richmond. And they shared how they went about creating this historic park and this memorial. But even before we had the speakers come in, I had the students go out and examine the site, imagine how they would have done things at this historic site, and to reach their own conclusions. But it was really useful to talk to people who do this all the time. We also had speakers on explosive history. We had Gabe Caprielian, an architect, come help us think about sightlines and space, and how to sketch and represent space. And as I mentioned, we had mosaic artists come and teach us how to make these beautiful mosaics that we put on concrete chunks that we found out there. And with all of this guidance, the students came up with just incredibly creative expressions of their own. And so Choyang Ponsar this is her sculpture. It's a circle of poppies. And this was her response to the concentric circles of incredible force of the accidental dynamite explosions at Fleming Point, right next door to the bulb, that were so powerful, they broke all the windows on the campus of UC Berkeley. Imagine an explosion that strong. And yet she represented it by this very gentle circle of poppies. Another thing that I think the students enjoyed was the fact that we didn't, for the most part, make our installations elsewhere and then bring them in. They were mostly made on site out of local materials. So the students here are making a mural about the Port of Oakland, and in the background you can see those actual cranes in the background, and this painting on the back of a bench is inviting you to think about what you're looking at. But because they had to be there for so many hours and so many days, they interacted with a lot of the park visitors who would come up to talk to them and ask them questions, and they were actually quite thankful to the students for doing this work. And the students learned that a lot of the history, most of the history that they were telling, that they had discovered and that they were sharing, was not known to the people who come here, in many cases, every day. So that experience of being present in the place, in the course of making their intervention, I think gave them a better sense of the place and made the intervention itself better. So this is my final picture about the project. One of the students using local materials, fennel sticks, that she's going to turn into a sculpture to frame the view. And, she's achieving part of what I hoped we would achieve, which is for the students to connect physically with the space, to really learn it by spending time there, and then to connect it with factual research, archival research, putting together a narrative and sharing it in that same space. So that is what we experimented with. We learned a lot along the way. And I just want to say thanks to the Creative Discovery Grant from Arts and Design, and also I attended some really wonderful workshops by the American Culture Center and their Creative Discovery program that helped all of us instructors think deeply about the ethics of community storytelling. And the whole project and Future Histories Lab, which I direct, and the Global Urban Humanities Initiative are funded by Andrew W. Mellon. And I just want to mention to students, if you're interested in taking courses like this, we are offering them again next year. If you go to the Future Histories Lab website, you can find hands-on studio courses like this, and you can earn, with just 3 classes, a certificate in urban humanities. And this summer, we have a really wonderful class called Hidden in Plain Sight, Public History and Public Space, that's going to be looking at many of the themes that I've discussed today about storytelling in public space and monuments, memory, archives, museums. So if you're interested, take a look at that. And here are some resources if you want to access further information, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Great. So maybe we can start collecting the cue cards too, or at the end. Oh, I see. Yeah,
sure.
Sorry, everyone. This is our first time doing our cue cards. So you keep your cue cards, students, and we'll collect them at the end. That way you can have them to ask your questions. So much. Susan, thank you. It's just such an honor to know you and your work and what you've contributed to our community here. And it's so beautiful to see the layers. Having visited the site and gone through the tour, it's just really informative to see behind the scenes and how you built this with the students. So thank you so much for sharing that. Let's give Susan a big round of applause. All right, so questions, ideas, concepts, thoughts, feedback. Yeah.
Hi. I just want to ask, is more art from both students and other artists expected to be added to the bulb? And if so, how does this, add to the monument's message or even change it?
That's a really great question. And if you're asking how does it add to the monument's message, meaning the whole thing as a monument, there's always new art being added to the bulb. It's beyond anybody's control. It's just a tradition out there. And in fact, a number of the installations that our students made have either fallen apart or been taken down, or have been altered in various ways, which is exactly what we expected. So I think that the addition and the changes that go on at the bulb just make it alive as a monument. And I think that's a really interesting question, thinking about what makes an effective monument. How does a monument work? The writer Robert Musil said, there's nothing as invisible as a monument. Because, we walk past statues all the time, completely ignoring them. Even the names on buildings, we walk past them, we use those names of streets and buildings all the time, and only later we discover, oh, that's who that was. And then sometimes we decide to change those names. But there's a certain kind of invisibility that comes with, attempts to commemorate. And how can we tell stories in a way that is constantly renewed? That takes some ongoing effort. And I think when commemoration requires ongoing effort, then those memories live on.
Thank you so much. I'm curious on, one, how many students were involved in the whole creation process? And how long did it take? Was it really all in one semester? This seems like a very deep and rich process. And how much agency did the students have in choosing what the stories were being told? Did you present them with options and then people went to which ones they wanted, or was it a discovery?
Yeah, those are really great questions. It was a lot to get done in a semester. And I did set up a pretty clear structure at the beginning. And I said, the things that we knew were that we were going to tell stories about multiple histories in this space through some kind of combination of walking tour and installations that experiment with augmented reality. And we didn't know exactly what that was going to look like. But we knew that the principle was that we were going to start with the materials at hand, because that's the extraction angle, and we were going to connect it outward from there. And so I provided a number of themes and topics that I knew there would be good stories included in. And among those, so there were 12 students, and they ended up working in 8 teams, so some people worked alone and some people worked in teams. And so among the stories, for example, that I suggested that we didn't tell, that we could have told, were the history of concrete and, sand mining, the history of steel in the Bay Area. There were, a number of other stories that we didn't tell. And so the students chose their own stories. And they also, I really appreciate this, took the stories in a very human direction. So the students who wanted to tell the story of bricks, they really wanted to talk about segregation, and at first I thought, well, that's kind of a leap. Is that a metaphor? But it really worked in the end. And I think it's partly because the books we read at the beginning included Rothstein's The Color of Law, about redlining. We read Laurette Savoy's Trace, talking about the experience of Black people in the outdoors and in relation to nature. We had a number of readings. We read Aldo Leopold, some classics of environmental writing. We read Richard Walker on the industrial history of the East Bay. So the students got to choose the stories they wanted to tell, and then they decided how they wanted to tell them. And in particular, the augmented reality and the sculptures were very much up to their creativity. But then we had to knit it all together. And we were really fortunate to have one of our students was at the journalism school and was an audio person, a radio person. And so she was able to stitch together the separate recordings really effectively. So that's kind of how we did. We kind of started at the beginning of the semester and said, go. We thought of it almost more like putting on a play. So back to the idea of the script or the score, that we knew we were going to, we wanted to have the tour ready to go for visitors by the end of the semester, and this is what we were going to need to do by that time. And we knew we needed to beta test the tour also and have some iterations. So there was a pretty clear structure from the start of what we were going to go through.
So my question is, was this always envisioned as being a student-involved project? And if so, was it why was it so important that students were involved with this project?
Yeah, it was always envisioned as a student project. I mean, I've done a lot of work at the Albany Bulb, organizing festivals and exhibitions and workshops, but this just seemed like a work that needed many hands to put together, and that seemed particularly well suited to giving students an opportunity to explore these questions that are both practical and technical about using these storytelling methods, while also giving them a chance to explore, archival research and the nature of narrative. So, when you look at other tours of this sort that are put together, and there are some really interesting ones out there, it always takes a team. And so this was our team.
I just wanted to ask, how did the idea of using AR in particular come into play in the class? And then also, how does mixing technology and sort of natural sensory experiences sort of add to the meaning, if at all, to the pieces at hand?
Yeah. Well, part of why we decided to use this particular AR was the opportunity that was presented by a grant that said, hey, try this out. And since I had been wanting to try AR, I thought I would love to try this Artivive. And it was fairly easy to use, although it wasn't designed for this particular application, so it didn't always work. I would say that we did not deeply explore the possibilities of AR because we were using so many different techniques. I mean, it would have been great to do nothing but say, okay, we're just going to explore how you can use augmented reality outside, and to answer the question that you asked of okay, we want to use it to help people be more present, to use their senses. We used it more just as a way to share some pictures, and I think it can do a lot more than that. So I think that's for future experiments, future classes. And I think that there's a trade-off between, if you want to dig into one question really deeply, then it's better to slow down and just do one thing. We wanted to have the experience of creating a finished experience and know what that's like and what that takes. And so that meant that each thing we spent less time on. But I would love to go back and spend more time on any one of the techniques, and particularly the augmented reality.
I have a question for the audience. Is how many, maybe you can raise your hand, have experienced an augmented reality tour, like something like this? Is anybody? A few people? Okay, yeah. So it's something that's growing in popularity. They tend to be in museums and settings. How many of those were outside? A few were outside. Okay, yeah. Great. Other questions? Mm-hmm.
Hi, I had another question. I was really fascinated with one of the points brought up earlier in the presentation about, how do we make a monument to a story more permanent? Like, what's the best way to kind of solidify the way we tell a story? And so, earlier when you answered my question about the kind of changing nature of the art pieces there, does the transient, nature of the art, add to the permanence of the story? Is change the only true permanence that we can kind of expect? It's kind of a more abstract question, but I was interested in knowing your thoughts.
Yes, I think you put it perfectly. I think in a way, the more transient it is, the more permanent. If it needs to be performed over and over, and if that tradition is passed down, whether it's an oral history or a tradition of remaking something in public space, I think it has the potential to connect more deeply with people, and the flexibility for stories to evolve over time. I mean, no version of the past is permanent, nor should it be. Right? We're retelling stories all the time, and that is as it should be, and we need to keep adding. And I think that any kind of commemorative act or object that allows for that retelling, that literally starts conversations and has people talking with each other, I think that's what's really valuable.
I wanted to build on that. Will you be doing this again at the Bulb as another layer?
I don't know what's up next.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to be adding layers, and I would love if other people, I mean, that's the thing about the Bulb, because it's not a very controlled space. It's a place where other people could create their own stories.
Maybe you could talk about the organization, about Love the Bulb, and how people can get involved, and
sure, yeah,
and how that works.
Yeah, so Love the Bulb is a nonprofit that works to protect the creative spirit of the bulb, and that encourages. We do curated festivals and exhibitions and workshops, but we also do advocacy to keep this a loose space so that lots of people can continue to do things out there, whether it's performances or making sculptures out of materials they find out there. And we are at, here I'll put that back, albanybulb.org is where we are. We have a newsletter. You can sign up for that. And, it's kind of pop-up. Things come up over time. So although I don't have a specific project coming up immediately, there will be things happening. So if you're interested in finding out what's going on, you can sign up for a newsletter. We also have a Facebook group, and the group is where people just, post their pictures and their projects and what's going on. And that's a good way to kind of connect with the community and see how that community functions. It's a community before social media that people would just meet each other in person or just kind of leave notes for each other. The notes being, graffiti or a sculpture or adding, a hat to somebody else's sculpture or, taking away a shoe or whatever. But Love the Bulb at albanybulb.org is a way that you can connect with us. And if you want to see more examples of storytelling of the sort we're doing, look at futurehistories.berkeley.edu, where you can see the work of our other courses. We've done augmented reality projects. Pablo Gonzalez in ethnic studies did a great project chronicling the protest murals in Oakland that were on plywood, and that project allows you to go look at the storefront now with your phone, and then you'll see the mural that used to be there, and you'll hear an interview with the artist. So that's another example of the kind of project that we've been working on. So we have all kinds of projects at futurehistories.org, or at .berkeley.edu.
Great. We'll take another question, and then another quick question for the group. How many people have been to the Albany Bulb? Oh, a fair amount. Okay. I recommend it highly now that you've gotten an experience here, and then come back and reflect through the materials Susan's brought us.
You mentioned that telling stories was at the center of the focus for this piece. I was wondering, within your years of creating and also with what you've gained in the experience of this project, what could you pass down to artists in the art of storytelling, and maybe sharing the place and the center that you reach when trying to tell a story?
Well, my storytelling has kind of evolved over time because my first career was as a journalist. And there's a kind of storytelling that you do as a journalist where you're listening and you're trying to give voice to the person you're listening to, and you're trying to put together a story. But there's always a distance, and the convention in that profession is that you are separate from the person whose story you're telling. what we've been experimenting with, especially at Future Histories Lab, is more collaborative storytelling, where the teller of the story, the owner of the story, has more control and more agency. But it's always a mediated process, so it's really complicated, I would say. And, you know, in telling your own story, you know, telling the story of my mother and her growing up at Terminal Island, she passed those stories on to me, and I tell them, and I feel an ownership of them. But they're just one version of that story and of that place, right? So I wouldn't claim that that is the story of that place, or that her experiences being interned at Manzanar, that was her experience. So, yeah, I would say that I'm experimenting with different kinds of storytelling and feeling more comfortable with ones that are closer to belonging to me. And I think the question of how to equitably and ethically work collaboratively with communities to tell stories is really, it's what we're working on at Future Histories Lab. And it takes time more than anything, and it takes trust, right? So I mentioned that we, in this semester, because we were working so fast, we decided we were not going to try to tell, you know, the Ohlone stories, because in the pandemic, it was just not possible to spend enough time together to do it right, and to, you know, put agency in the hands of the people whose story it belonged to. So I don't know, those are just some kind of random thoughts, but does that answer your question at all? Yeah.
I guess I was just wondering, especially during this time, there was, at least for me, a lot of turmoil in my head about whether monuments are a good way to honor the story of people, especially because they were usually used to honor people who have caused a lot of pain to minority communities. And I was just wondering if you had any insight on how the students were feeling during this, or if because it was meant to change during in the future, and that they were doing something so connected to the space they were in, that they were more, I guess, willing to tell the stories that you mentioned earlier?
Well, I think they really wanted to tell the stories of the people who tend not to be memorialized. But I wonder, we have one of the students here. I don't know, Rhodey, can I put you on the spot? Yeah, okay, so I'm really glad. I didn't know Rhodey would be here. He was one of the students in the class. So you can ask him lots of questions about what the experience was like.
It was kind of hard, honestly, hearing the different stories, and then trying to represent that equitably and tell a story that, you know, you really have no space or idea. You can only take history or the research you did and then present it in a way that you think would best be received by people on a short little tour.
So it sounds like there was a lot of thinking about that, how to represent, and the complexity of that, and then the layers of trying to memorialize those who tend not to be memorialized, trying to surface and make visible the stories, but in a way that honored them. I'm echoing that too, hearing you say that too, Susan. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions around that, making art or representation in telling stories? And
I feel this is super inspirational. This combination of art and storytelling and place and bringing all of that together. And I absolutely love that project. I was wondering whether there are other places where this is happening, and whether there is then somehow a connection built so that we can discover these things worldwide, and with this tour and augmented reality, and then wherever you travel, then you could find these kind of things where you then also can add your art to it. And I was wondering if there is a place for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many interesting tours being created, and tours being created in for the purpose of activism. So Future Histories Lab is working with the Black Liberation Walking Tour in West Oakland. They've done a really great job telling local history there. And they've used some recording technologies to make what would be just a live walking tour more accessible to more people. There is an organization called Museum of the Hidden City, and they did a really great augmented reality tour of the Fillmore district in San Francisco. Really very high production values, using actors or poets who represented characters, characters who were real historical characters, but with a script written for them. And you walk around as if you are guided by these historical characters. And then you also see images of what used to be there. So that's an example of an augmented reality tour. There are a lot of really great audio tours. There was a company called Detour that did fantastic work, but unfortunately they got sold to Bose, and so a lot of their tours are not available anymore, including a really wonderful one that somebody made of the Albany Bulb. We had a speaker series last fall called Place-Based Storytelling and Techniques, and you can find that the list of our speakers and videos of a number of those speakers on our Future Histories Lab, futurehistories.berkeley.edu website. And that, I think, might be a good starting point if you're interested in learning more about those sorts of tours and projects. But there's a lot going on.
I would just add that the Fillmore District tour that Susan spoke about was very inspirational and was a good starting point for the class. Not a starting point, but a good example. And the tour takes you through the Fillmore, but also instead of the bulb where we're making art, it points out historic landmarks that are just like a brick in the ground or a church or the mall in Japantown, and how that history relates to other things in the landscape. So that was probably one of my favorite parts of the class.
While we have you, Brody, I mean, we don't always have a chance to ask students, now that you've had some time since the end of the class, what has stuck with you? What has changed in your mind about what you understood about the experience? Is there anything that you feel has been useful in the long run or that you changed your mind about?
Definitely. I think about this class a lot, actually, as trying to get into the city planning field and my agency as augmenting a landscape and who I'm representing, who's going to use that space, how our body's going to show up in that space. So I think that was the biggest takeaway I have of this class is what's my agency as just someone with a job to create a space where other people are going to use it, and how will they interact with it? And what do I even have a place to make a space for someone else was probably my biggest takeaway. And I think about it a lot, how what I do will affect someone else's day in their neighborhood.
Yeah, it sounds like you leading or experiencing and leading with a lot of empathy, or bringing that into how you design and think about building in the future.
And I think, what Brody brought up earlier, that, we struggled with telling people's stories who we didn't have a close community partner, both because there wasn't time and because of the pandemic and because we were trying to move so quickly. But in reality, when you're working in professional city planning practice, you're working even faster than that, right? You're really working fast. And how can you actually listen to communities and get to know, their relationship to place? How can we do that? I have to say more efficiently, because by efficient, I mean we have to understand that connection but do it within the pressures of the planning process. And I think that's really a challenge. And I think, when you do work like this, Brody and I and the students were doing, you realize, wow, we're just scratching the surface. And, it can make you cautious about intervening. And sometimes it's good to be cautious about intervening, right? But sometimes things need to get done. And so I think that's a real tension. But I think, the role of artists and storytellers is to be constantly augmenting that. So if in the world around us, outside of the formal planning or political process, if these stories are, constantly being daylighted and in the works and being shared, then it's known even before we start the formal planning process. And that baseline, if we can raise that baseline knowledge about place and about history and about our connections, then, hopefully that will make for better and more just politics. And I think that's why the role of artists and storytellers is important, as well as that of storytellers and technicians and politicians.
Building on that, have you thought of using the VR version of this? You said you were getting news stories sent to you from people not here anymore, but they have a connection to this place, perhaps, or using the VR if for people who might not be able to get to the bulb themselves, but have connection either through family or being there or growing up, and adding it into the virtual space as a way to continue the layering.
Yeah, I think that would be a great idea to figure out how to make it additive and make it available to people who aren't there, and to do it in a way that's engaging enough that it's shared. I mean, that's the thing about this baseline knowledge. It needs to be shared in a way that people connect with it. So I think that's really important. It's interesting that the project did end up interacting with a formal planning process, because there was a master planning process for all of Albany's, the city of Albany's parks, and one small part of that was planning for the Albany Bulb. And the planners who were hired to do that process took our tour and were very interested in it. And it was part of how they learned about the bulb. And in fact, it was they who made that short video of what it's like walking through. So I was really grateful for that. But they actually made that little video and then they shared it as part of the planning process. So I was really heartened that although, we didn't have any particular outcome that we were aiming for in any formal planning process, but those stories and that experience of the bulb did get integrated, at least to a small extent, into a regular planning process.
Yeah, you've alluded to some changes you would make. I think if you did a 2.0 version of this, and so maybe I'd just like to hear a summary, if you have one in mind, in terms of the technology and the process, and maybe if you could say a little bit more about public interfacing as part of the prototyping process or evaluation. You didn't say too much about evaluation.
Yeah. So definitely, I think I would do it as a two semester class. I mean, in terms of the class itself, or if it weren't a class per se, to have a much longer process and to have just a research session, a research semester before a production semester, and also a kind of months of kind of community engagement and collection of stories, because the collection of those stories, that process, if we were doing it through, for example, collecting oral histories, that's as important as the final process, right? That's something we didn't do or have time to do, but that's something that I would definitely want to do. And also, as I mentioned, to spend more time thinking through what the augmented reality is really good for and what are the story, we need to iterate those stories and kind of road test them as well, not just technically, but in terms of what those stories would be. And in terms of evaluation, yes, I would set things up so that we knew how to track, who was coming and seeing us. And we did get, we did 3 different tours as kind of the grand finale, as our final review. So we took, it was at least 30 people in several groups who gave us really great feedback through direct conversation. So they took the tour, and then we had a conversation out at the Bulb on some very, very cold days, I remember, even though it was April. It's hard to say now that we're having these 70 degrees days in February. But we did get that direct feedback from folks, but it would have been nice to set up more opportunities, and also more opportunities for people to more explicitly interact with and alter and add their stories. There were little ways that some of the installations, invited people to write things down or to add things or to move the bricks or whatever. But I think that could be much, much more developed. And I think that could be really interesting. And I think that also, within neighborhoods, that can be really valuable. I mean, when you're working in public space, there's a question of durability, right? And vandalism and, what gets destroyed and shared and not. And out at the Bulb, it's really kind of, anything goes. So we were not upset when things were altered or even, torn down, because we knew that might happen. If you're doing that in a neighborhood, it has a different feeling. And so thinking through how can you make something durable enough that it can be interactive, or maybe you only have that interaction when somebody's physically there. And then you have those very personal connections, and you have pop-up events. I think that can be really valuable too. But it's all very labor intensive, and that's the value of it, because that's the effort of the storytelling and the retelling. And that's what makes it permanent is the sweat equity that whoever is involved has in sharing and collecting the stories.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, please.
I was just going to respond and say, in some way, you provided us like a prototype of something to try and build upon and grow, or to offer your field of urban planning and design, to say, look, here's a new way, or an alternative way, or adding to the kind of processes that are in place, or building on past ones to keep that alive in the pedagogy, and so that the future generations might begin to build on what you're suggesting here.
Yeah, just a quick part two, which is clearly you're doing really innovative public storytelling work, and you just shared this, a lot with us that I'm sure we're all inspired to do our own version of this, perhaps in our own places. But are you actually codifying formally the experience-bred wisdom, the mistakes, the successes in a place where it becomes, in effect, a kind of a playbook of best practices for people, again, like this gentleman said, all over the world?
Yeah, well, we're actually working on a book that's looking not just at this particular kind of storytelling, but, the Global Urban Humanities Initiative, which started in 2013 with a Mellon grant, and which Future Histories Lab and this class is one part of. We've been doing a lot of different kinds of experiments, combining methods across disciplines. And so we are working on figuring out how to share those lessons. I'm just curious, I'd ask you what format, what would be most valuable to you? What do you think people are looking for if it were a book? Are you interested in like a recipe book, or kind of, theoretical background, or?
Honestly, I think it's a website that would be best, where you can be updating it regularly, and you could be inviting contributions from, again, people all over the world who are doing this.
Okay, well, that's a point well taken.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna end with that as an idea for the future. And I just thank you so much for this. Basically, you've brought us this provocation that you've tried and tested and are willing to share out in the world, and so inspired by what you were able to bring us and share, and what you were able to process in this project. So thank you so much, Susan, for this really insightful presentation and talk today.
Well, thanks for the opportunity, Lisa, and thanks again for the support. Appreciate it.
Yes.
Thank you, everybody.
You.